He took his new girlfriend for a luxury night out, but freezes when he sees his stunning ex being cheered on stage. He arrived late, as he always did when the event wasn't about him. The Chicago Civic Opera House, with its towering columns and the crimson velvet draping the seats, breathed a grandeur that Daniel Hayes believed belonged by right to his world. But that night, the grandeur didn't include him. He entered arm in arm with Victoria Kane, the sophisticated and ambitious architect who now occupied the place that had once been his wife's. Victoria, in her designer dress and calculated smile, surveyed the room with an air of bored superiority, as if inspecting a project she didn't approve. They walked down the side aisle, seeking their seats in the dim light. While on stage, under the warm and solitary beam of a spotlight, a woman in a simple dress and upright shoulders approached the microphone. It was Olivia. Her name, Olivia Reed, still echoed through the hall, pronounced seconds earlier by the MC with a formality that seemed strange, almost sacred. Camera flashes exploded in the audience, but the main light was on her, enveloping her in a golden aura that separated her from the rest of the world. She didn't smile expansively. There was a serenity on her face, a calm that belonged only to those who had crossed through hell and learned not to fear the fire anymore. Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with a contained strength, a silent certainty that disarmed anyone who looked at her closely. Daniel found his seat, adjusting his expensive suit, and his gaze crossed the stage. For an instant, time seemed to freeze. He saw her, not as the woman he had left behind, but as a stranger, a public figure to whom everyone there paid reverence. The murmur of admiration in the audience was a low and constant buzz, a chorus of voices he couldn't decipher, but whose feeling was unmistakable. Respect. If anyone has ever doubted you or your potential, subscribe and leave a like. We tell stories like this to remind you that sometimes the silence of those who win speaks louder than the applause of those who doubted. Victoria whispered something in his ear, a sharp criticism about Olivia's drab dress, but Daniel barely heard. He was paralyzed by an unbearable dissonance. That woman whom he had labeled a dreamer, naive, without ambition, was at the center of his universe, receiving the kind of acclaim he had always coveted for himself. Years earlier, in their small apartment crammed with books, he used to mock the nights she spent awake, writing in her notebooks. "This doesn't pay the bills, Olivia," he would say, with the arrogance of someone who only understood the value of the concrete, the tangible. "You should focus on something real." Now, her name, the fruit of those wasted nights, was the most real thing in that theater. It echoed off the gilded walls, the ornate details of the ceiling, and settled into the heavy silence that formed inside him. While the audience prepared for the applause to come, Daniel remained motionless, his hands resting on his knees, unable to move. His silence wasn't a protest. It was the confession of his defeat, the only applause she, in fact, never needed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The story of that night didn't begin under the lights of a stage, but in the dimness of an apartment in the Wicker Park neighborhood, 3 years earlier, when Olivia's dreams were still just words whispered in a notebook, and Daniel's disdain was the loudest sound in her life. Let me go back to the morning when everything began to crumble, or perhaps to rebuild. 3 years earlier, Olivia's world wasn't a lit stage, but a small apartment in Chicago's Wicker Park neighborhood, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the scent of old pages. The nights were her territory, a silent sanctuary claimed after a long day teaching literature in a public school that drained her energy, but not her spirit. It was there, at the wooden dining table she'd inherited from her grandmother, under the yellowish light of a lamp, that she became who she truly was. Surrounded by stacks of books that served as both reference and fortress, she dove into her notebooks, the pen gliding across the paper with a silent urgency. Each word was a brick, each sentence a wall, and every night she built entire worlds, populated by characters who felt, suffered, and loved with an intensity that real life seemed to have denied her. Daniel, her husband, didn't understand this construction. To him, a civil engineer whose mind operated in right angles and load calculations, what couldn't be measured, weighed, or turned into profit was, at best, a hobby, at worst, a useless distraction. He arrived late, his body tired from the construction site, his mind already projecting the next building, the next contract. The sound of the key turning in the lock was the signal for Olivia, a subtle alarm that brought her back to reality. She closed the notebook almost by instinct, as if protecting a fragile secret. On that particular night, the sound of the door closing was louder, more impatient. Daniel tossed his leather briefcase onto the couch with an exasperated sigh, loosening his tie as if it were choking him. His eyes scanned the room and landed on her, at the table, with the coffee mug beside her and the concentrated expression he had come to detest. "Writing again?" he said, his voice laden with a tiredness that was less physical and more existential. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "This doesn't pay the bills, Olivia. You should focus on something real." The word real came out of his mouth with crushing weight, a verdict. For Daniel, the real was the concrete he poured, the bricks he stacked, the luxury condos he sold to the city's elite. The real had a price, an address, and preferably, a skyline view. What she did, that feverish scribbling in cheap notebooks, was a fantasy, an escape from the life he was trying to build for them both. A life of status, appearances, dinners at expensive restaurants where they could be seen. Olivia didn't respond with words. She just offered a small, tired smile and put the notebook away in the drawer. It was a ritual that repeated with painful frequency. The smile was her armor, a thin but resilient barrier against his veiled disdain. She got up, went to the kitchen, and warmed the dinner he would barely touch, while he turned on the TV to the news channel, diving into the noise of the world to avoid facing the silence growing between them. He built buildings, imposing structures of steel and glass that pierced Chicago's skyline. She built worlds, complex universes of emotion and meaning, woven with the fragile thread of the human condition. And he, in his blind pursuit of solidity, never realized that her worlds were infinitely more solid, because they were made of truth, not concrete. Their love didn't die from a single blow. It was poisoned slowly, drop by drop, by the venom of Daniel's ambition. At the beginning of their marriage, he admired her sensitivity. He found it poetic the way she described the afternoon light coming through the window, or how she got emotional over a verse from Whitman. He saw in her a counterpoint to his own pragmatic nature, an oasis of delicacy in his logic-driven life. But that admiration began to sour when his career took off. Promoted to partner at the construction firm, Daniel was introduced to a new social circle, a world of appearances where a person's value was measured by the car they drove, the vacations they took, the brand of watch on their wrist. And subtly, he began to see Olivia not as an oasis but as an anchor. The cracks appeared first in the small details. He started criticizing her clothes, suggesting she should dress more elegantly, more appropriately, for business dinners. He mocked her friends, teachers, and artists who, according to him, debated the meaning of life while the world turned. The apartment in Wicker Park, which had once been their nest, became too small, too simple. Daniel wanted to move to Gold Coast, to a penthouse with a gourmet balcony, a visible symbol of his success. Olivia resisted. She loved the neighborhood, the proximity to bookstores, the sense of community the old area offered. "Our life is here, Daniel," she argued, with a calm that irritated him deeply. "A home isn't made of square footage, it's made of memories." To him, that phrase was the definitive proof of her naivety. Memories didn't buy respect. The contrast between them became an abyss. He was the concrete, she the poetry. He saw the world in spreadsheets and timelines, she in metaphors and narratives. When he looked at the city's horizon, he saw investment opportunities, lots to be developed. When she looked at the same horizon, she saw stories, the lights of apartments like thousands of lives pulsing in the darkness, each with its own drama, its own joy, its own pain. He talked about interest rates, markets, trends. She talked about empathy, loneliness, redemption. They were two different languages spoken under the same roof, and translation had become impossible. Love, which had once been the bridge between these two worlds, began to buckle under the weight of his ambition. The mockery of her writing intensified. It stopped being a casual comment and became a weapon, a way to diminish her, to invalidate the essence of who she was. "If you at least made money from it," he said, "I'd understand. But it's just a hobby, Olivia. An expensive hobby if you count the hours you waste on it. He didn't see the hours as an investment in her soul, but as a loss on the marital balance sheet. He wanted a partner who would propel him in the corporate world, a woman who organized impeccable dinners, laughed at his boss's jokes, was a luxury accessory on his arm. Olivia, with her books, her idealism, and her refusal to play the game of appearances, was an embarrassment. She was the embodiment of everything he was desperately trying to leave behind: simplicity, authenticity, life without artifice. One night, after a company event that Olivia had refused to attend, inventing a headache, Daniel came home euphoric and slightly drunk. He found her, as always, at the living room table writing, but instead of mocking, he sat across from her, a strange gleam in his eyes. "You have no idea what you're missing," he said, his voice a bit slurred. "Connections, Olivia. That's how the world works. Tonight I closed $1 million pre-contract during a chat at the bar. And you here writing about what anyway? The sadness of the houseplant?" He laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the night's silence. Olivia lifted her eyes from the notebook. For the first time, there was no smile on her face. There was only a deep tiredness, an ancient pain finally surfacing. "I write about people, Daniel," she said, her voice low but firm. "I write about the feeling of not being seen, about the silence that screams inside a marriage. I write about men who build skyscrapers, but can't see the person sleeping next to them." The precision of the words hit him like a punch. His smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. He stood up, the chair scraping the floor. "Is that a threat?" he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "Are you using our life as material for your mediocre little stories?" "I use what I feel," she replied, her voice unwavering. "And lately, what I feel most is disappointment." It was the first time she verbalized the fracture, the first time her poetry became a weapon pointed directly at him. Daniel didn't know how to react. He, the man of ready answers, of logical arguments, was disarmed by a sentence. He turned his back and went to the bedroom, slamming the door with a force that made the bookshelf glasses tremble. That night, Olivia didn't go back to writing. She sat in the darkness, listening to the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of traffic, and understood that the building they had built together was doomed. The foundations were corroded, and demolition was just a matter of time. She didn't feel fear. She felt a strange and desolate peace, the same peace that precedes a storm. The end was near, and she knew that when it came, it wouldn't find her on her knees. It would find her holding a pen, ready to write the next chapter, alone. The demolition didn't come with the boom of an implosion, but with the silent arrival of Victoria Kane. She didn't burst into their lives by breaking down the door. She was invited in through the front door, under the pretext of a professional partnership. Victoria was the architect of the moment in Chicago, a woman whose reputation preceded her. She was charismatic, with an easy laugh that sounded like music in corporate settings, and seductive in a way that wasn't obvious, but intellectual. She didn't wear deep necklines. She wore intelligent arguments. Her weapon wasn't conventional beauty, but an unshakable self-confidence, a gleam in her eyes that said she didn't just belong in that world of power and ambition, but dominated it. For Daniel, she was the embodiment of everything he had come to desire. Victoria was the success project he wanted to sign, the partner who spoke his language, the woman who didn't write poetry about the sadness of the houseplant, but designed the rooftop gardens of the city's most expensive apartments. The project that brought them together was the firm's most ambitious yet, a luxury complex in Lincoln Park. The technical meetings became Daniel's new routine. At first, he talked about them with purely professional enthusiasm. He described to Olivia, during the rare moments they dined together, the genius of Victoria's solutions, how she optimized spaces, how her vision added value to the development. Olivia listened, with the attention of a spectator studying a character. She saw the gleam in her husband's eyes, a gleam she hadn't seen in years, and knew it wasn't just the architecture that fascinated him. It was the architect. The meetings began to stretch into the night, turning into strategic dinners. Then came the business trips on weekends, to visit design fairs in New York, or for field analysis in high-end condos in Miami. Olivia felt the distancing not as a crack, but as a change in atmospheric pressure. The air inside the apartment became thin, hard to breathe. The silence between them, which had once been heavy, was now empty, a vacuum where a story once existed. The signs were cliched, almost banal in their predictability, but each was a small cut in her soul. The phone, which used to be forgotten on the table, was now an appendage to Daniel's body, always with the screen face down, like a secret kept under lock and key. He started taking the device to the bathroom, and showers, once quick and functional, became long and drawn out. The sound of the water muffling whispers of conversations that weren't for her. When he returned from the trips, his clothes no longer smelled of hotel, but of an expensive feminine perfume, a floral and woody scent that didn't belong to Olivia and that seemed to impregnate the whole house, a ghostly presence that suffocated her. She didn't confront him. What would she say? "Your phone is always face down." Or, "You're taking too long in the shower." The accusations would sound small, petty, the kind of complaint from a jealous and insecure wife that she refused to be. Olivia was an observer of the human condition, and now she watched the crumbling of her own marriage as if it were a play, with a painful clarity and an almost clinical distance. She saw Daniel's performance, the poorly disguised guilt in his eyes when he brought her a gift for no reason, the growing irritation with any question about his day, the way he evaded her touch. He was becoming a stranger, a bad actor in a poorly rehearsed play, and the audience of one, her, knew the script by heart. She didn't need a confession. The betrayal was no longer in his acts, but in the air they breathed. The confirmation, when it came, was as cold and impersonal as a medical report. On a Saturday morning, Daniel went out for a run but left his phone on the nightstand. It was an atypical mistake, a lapse in his new routine of vigilance. The device vibrated, the screen lit up for a moment. Olivia, passing through the bedroom with a cup of coffee in hand, saw the notification on the locked screen. It was a message from Victoria Architect. The name was professional, almost antiseptic, but the message unfolding below it was anything but. Just one sentence, short and devastating, that summed up everything. "You're everything she'll never be." In that instant, time stopped. The hum of the city outside disappeared. The smell of the coffee in her hands dissipated. There were only those 7 words, glowing on the screen, a final sentence, an epitaph for their marriage. There was no scream, no tear rolling down her face. The pain that hit her was so deep, so overwhelming, that it manifested as a total absence of feeling, an icy calm that took over her body. It was the calm of the epicenter of an earthquake, the silence in the eye of a hurricane. She picked up the phone. Her finger hovered over his fingerprint reader. Access she still had, a remnant of an intimacy that no longer existed. She didn't need to unlock it, didn't need to read the rest of the conversation. That phrase was enough. It was Victoria's voice, but the words were the echo of everything Daniel had been telling her, silently, for years. It was the confirmation that she was the unambitious woman, the useless dreamer, the piece that didn't fit in the puzzle of the life he wanted to assemble. With deliberate slowness, she placed the phone back on the nightstand exactly in the same spot, with the screen face down, as he always left it. She turned her back on the bedroom, on the bed they no longer truly shared, and walked through the house. Her steps didn't falter. She went to the living room, to her desk, her sanctuary. She sat in the wooden chair, opened the drawer and took out not the notebook where she wrote her stories, but a new one with a black cover that she had bought and hadn't yet had the courage to use. She opened it to the first page. The pen in her hand didn't tremble. And then she wrote. It wasn't a farewell letter nor a diary of laments. It was a declaration, an epiphany. Some pains aren't screamed. They're written in silence until the world reads them. Those words weren't about Daniel or Victoria. They were about her. They were the discovery that her strength wasn't in confronting, in fighting, in demanding explanations. Her strength was in her ability to transform the rawest pain into art, the deepest suffering into narrative. While her husband ran through the city's streets, fleeing a guilt that would eventually catch up to him, she sat motionless, turning the poison into ink. In that moment, she understood that Daniel's greatest betrayal wasn't sleeping with another woman. It was trying to convince her that her dreams were worthless, that her voice didn't deserve to be heard. And her response wouldn't be a scandal, wouldn't be a scene of jealousy, wouldn't be a litigious division of assets. Her response would be the work of her life. When Daniel returned, sweaty and panting, he found her in the same position, writing. He didn't notice the new notebook, nor the absence of tears in her eyes, nor the new firmness in her posture. He just saw the same scene as always, and felt the same irritation as always. "Still at it," he grumbled as he went to the shower, a quick shower this time, as if guilt were drowning him. Olivia didn't respond, she just kept writing, the initial sentence now unfolding into a paragraph, the paragraph into a page, the page into the beginning of a story. The story of a woman who was left behind but refused to stay down. The story of a pain so silent that one day it would become deafening. She didn't plan revenge. Revenge was a small act, a spasm of anger that exhausted itself. What she planned was something much bigger, much more enduring. She planned a rebirth, and rebirths, she knew, begin with the complete demolition of the old world. Olivia's departure didn't have the dramatics of a movie scene. There were no suitcases thrown down the stairs, no final confrontation full of accusations and tears. It happened with the same quietness with which she had discovered the betrayal. On a grey Tuesday, while Daniel was at another of his strategic meetings, she simply packed her life. She didn't take the expensive furniture he had insisted on buying, nor the decorative objects that symbolized a life that was never hers. She took only her clothes, her books, hundreds of them, stacked in cardboard boxes that seemed too heavy for her slender frame, and the notebooks, especially the black-covered notebook, which now held the beginning of her new existence. When Daniel arrived at the apartment that night, he found a different silence, a silence that wasn't tense, but absent. Her keys were on the dining table, next to a single folded paper. Inside there was no letter of hate, but a single sentence, written in the perfect handwriting of a literature teacher. "I've gone to build my own worlds. I hope you're happy in yours." She moved to the Logan Square neighborhood, an area of Chicago that breathed history and simplicity, the exact opposite of the sterile luxury where Daniel dreamed of taking her. She found a small and old apartment, with hardwood floors and tall windows that flooded the living room with light. It was a space that needed care, but it was hers. For the first time in years, she felt she could breathe. The air was no longer thin from the lie. The silence was no longer an abyss, but a blank canvas. To support herself, she left the job at the public school that exhausted her and started giving private writing lessons. She scattered some flyers in neighborhood cafes and bookstores, and soon her reputation as a dedicated and insightful teacher attracted students, anxious college applicants, professionals wanting to improve their communication, aspiring writers who, like her, had stories stuck in their throats. Teaching others to find their own voice helped her, paradoxically, to strengthen hers. It was in this refuge of light and books that she created the blog. She gave it an anonymous name, The Architect of Words, a subtle irony that only she understood. There she began publishing the texts born in the black-covered notebook. They were short stories, chronicles about love, loss, silence, and the complex web of emotions hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. She didn't write with the intention of being read by many. The blog was an extension of her diary, a place to organize the pain and transform it into something beautiful, or at least something that made sense. She wrote about women who felt invisible in their own homes, about the acute pain of being replaced, about the strength discovered in the rubble of a collapsed life. Her prose was elegant but visceral, stripped of cheap sentimentality. There was a brutal honesty in her words, a truth that resonated deeply with those who read her. Megan, her best friend since college, was one of the few people who knew about the blog. Megan was the opposite of Olivia, expansive, pragmatic, and with little patience for injustices. She followed her friend's suffering in silence, respecting her need for seclusion, but felt a helpless fury against Daniel. One night, reading a new text on the blog, Megan was overtaken by conviction. The text was called The Woman Who Learned to Stay Silent. It narrated the story of a wife who, instead of confronting her husband's infidelity, channeled her pain into creation, discovering that silence can be the most powerful response. The narrative was so potent, so universal, that Megan felt it couldn't stay confined to an anonymous blog. Without telling Olivia, she copied the post's link and emailed it to Alex Turner, an independent editor she knew from literary events, a man known for his nose for new talent. In the email, Megan wrote only, "I think you need to read this. It's the most honest voice I've read in years." Alex Turner, a skeptical man overloaded with unsolicited manuscripts, almost deleted the email, but the text's title intrigued him. He clicked and read again, and felt the shiver an editor feels few times in life. The sensation of being in front of something genuine, an authentic voice amid a sea of imitations. He didn't just like it, he understood. He understood the contained pain, the underlying strength, the elegance of that silent revenge. That same night, he shared the text on his social media, followed by a considerable number of journalists, critics, and literature lovers. Alex's caption was simple: "Read this and understand the power of the written word. Sometimes the greatest shout is silence." What happened next was spontaneous combustion. The text went viral. It started in literary niches, then jumped to women's groups, was shared by digital influencers, psychologists, and finally, by major online media. The woman who learned to stay silent became a phenomenon. The story touched an exposed nerve in society, the silent pain of countless women who felt undervalued, traded, silenced. The author's anonymity only increased the mystery and the narrative's strength. Who was this architect of words who wrote with such precision about the female soul? Olivia, in her Logan Square apartment, watched it all with a mix of panic and awe. Her blog's inbox, once empty, exploded. There were hundreds, then thousands of messages from women across the country. "Your story is my story," said one. "You put into words what I've felt for 10 years, wrote another. "Thank you for making me feel less alone." She, who had felt like the loneliest woman in the world, had become, overnight, the confidant of a nation of silent women. Meanwhile, Daniel's life took the opposite direction. The initial euphoria of his relationship with Victoria began to dissipate, revealing what lay beneath, a gleaming emptiness. The passion, built on the excitement of the forbidden and mutual admiration for ambition, didn't withstand the banality of everyday life. Victoria wasn't the understanding partner he had imagined. She was as competitive and egocentric as he was, perhaps more. Their relationship became a subtle battlefield, a constant dispute for attention, validation, power. The fights were frequent, explosive, fueled by jealousy and mutual distrust. If he had cheated on her, why wouldn't he do the same to her? If she had seduced him while he was married, who else could she seduce? The foundation of their relationship was betrayal, and on such a rotten base, nothing solid could be built. The turbulence in his personal life began to bleed into his professional life. The partnership with Victoria on the big Lincoln Park project, once the source of his triumph, became a nightmare. Heated arguments about the relationship invaded work meetings. Deadlines were missed, decisions made based on rancor, and team harmony fell apart. To make matters worse, the economy started showing signs of recession, and the luxury real estate market, so dependent on confidence and stability, was the first to feel the blow. Contracts were cancelled, investors backed out. The firm, which had bet all its chips on that development, went into crisis. Daniel, the partner who had promised the future, was now seen as responsible for the impending failure. His arrogance, once tolerated as a byproduct of success, was now viewed as pure incompetence. He, who had always felt like the master of the universe, the man who built reality with his own hands, saw his world crumble, brick by brick. One afternoon, sitting in his luxurious but now silent office, Daniel browsed the internet, procrastinating the moment to face another loss report. He came across an article on a major news portal. The phenomenon of the blog The Architect of Words. Who is the author giving voice to the silence of thousands of women? He clicked, driven by idle curiosity. The article quoted excerpts from the viral text, "The Woman Who Learned to Stay Silent." As he read the words, Daniel felt a chill. The prose was elegant, contained, but the pain behind it was unmistakable. It was Olivia's pain. The construction metaphor, silence as response, loneliness inside a marriage, they were intimate details too much for coincidence. The architect of words. The irony of the name hit him like a punch in the gut. He, the engineer, the builder, had fallen for a real architect, while his wife, whom he despised, became an architect of worlds, of emotions, of narratives that the whole country read. He felt exposed, dissected, turned into a secondary and pathetic character in her story, a story he didn't even know was being written. While he sank into the ruins of his own ego, she raised a new life, word by word, and he realized, with icy terror, that the most devastating demolition wasn't of their marriage, but of his own identity. 2 years passed. 2 years that for Olivia weren't a passage of time, but a careful and deliberate reconstruction. The viral success of the blog, The Architect of Words, pulled her out of anonymity gradually and respectfully. Alex Turner, the editor who had discovered her talent, became her mentor and eventually her friend. He convinced her to reveal her identity, not as a marketing ploy, but as an act of owning her own story. The revelation that the mysterious author was a literature teacher from Chicago with a personal story of overcoming only amplified the interest in her work. Alex encouraged her to gather her stories, polish her narratives, and turn them into a book. The result was a collection titled Chronicles of Silence, a work that captured with cutting honesty the nuances of pain, resilience, and female rebirth. The book wasn't an explosive bestseller, but a critical and public success, one of those books that spread by word of mouth, that are gifted between friends, that become study objects in reading clubs. Olivia's life found a serene rhythm, a soft melody that contrasted with the cacophony of her past. Her routine was simple, but full. Mornings were dedicated to writing, in her apartment now filled with plants and a light that seemed to have made peace with the shadows. Afternoons were for her students, young and adults whom she didn't just teach the structure of an essay, but the courage to express their own internal worlds. She became a beloved figure in Logan Square, known by the owners of the cafes where she spent hours reading, by Mr. Harlan, the owner of the used bookstore who became her literary confidant, and by the neighbors who saw her walking the tree-lined streets with the air of someone who had found her place in the world. She didn't become rich or famous in the strident sense of the word. She became sovereign of her own life, an infinitely more valuable conquest. On an autumn afternoon, while grading her students' essays, an email with the seal of the state of Illinois arrived in her inbox. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from an anticipation she hadn't felt in a long time. The email was a formal invitation. Her collection, Chronicles of Silence, had been selected as one of the 3 finalists for the prestigious Chicago Literary Award, the highest literary honor in the state. Olivia read the email 3 times, the words seeming to dance before her. It wasn't a niche prize, not recognition from a small circle. It was validation from the cultural establishment, the same culture Daniel had once said was a waste of time. She closed the laptop, walked to the window and looked at the city. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or pain. They were tears of silent gratitude, an acknowledgement of the long path she had traveled, of the rubble she had to remove to get there. The award night arrived, and with it, a gala atmosphere that seemed to belong to another universe. The Chicago Civic Opera House, the same stage of her teenage fantasies, was packed. Journalists, politicians, artists, and Chicago's cultural elite mingled in the lobby, their voices echoing under the crystal chandeliers. Olivia arrived accompanied by Megan and Alex. She wore a navy blue dress, simple but elegant in cut, a piece that didn't scream for attention but exuded quiet confidence. She felt a bit out of place, an observer at a party that wasn't hers, but the firm presence of her friends anchored her. They found their seats in the front row, and Olivia looked around, absorbing the grandeur of the place, the irony of being there, not as a spectator, but as the protagonist. On the other side of the theater, in the dimness of the middle rows, Daniel Hayes arrived late, as was his habit. He wasn't there for literary interest. The firm, in a desperate attempt to clean its image after the financial disaster, had become one of the event's sponsors, and his presence was mandatory. Beside him, Victoria Kane, wrapped in a vibrant red dress that seemed an affront to the venue's sobriety, displayed a tense smile. Their life was no longer the fairy tale of success they had projected. Daniel's company was on the brink of bankruptcy, and Victoria's career had been tarnished by association with the failure. The relationship, devoid of the adrenaline of conquest and luxury, had revealed itself hollow, a burden of resentment and mutual accusations. They were two castaways clinging to each other in a sea of frustration. Victoria flipped through the event program with disdain, and her finger stopped on a name. Olivia Reed, she read aloud, the name sounding like poison in her mouth. She turned to Daniel, her eyes sparking with disbelief and contempt. "I can't believe she was invited to this," she whispered, her tone loaded with an envy she could barely disguise. For Victoria, Olivia was the unambitious ex-wife, the suburban teacher, a footnote in the success story she had tried to write with Daniel. Seeing her there, as a finalist for such an important award, was a distortion of reality, a personal offense. Daniel didn't respond. He just looked at the stage, his face an impenetrable mask, and saw Olivia seated in the front row. She seemed serene, distant, as if belonging to a world he could no longer reach. The ceremony began. Speeches were made, tributes paid. Finally, the main category arrived. The presenter, a well-known actor, took the stage, holding the golden envelope with the air of someone guarding a state secret. He spoke about the importance of literature, the power of words, the exceptional quality of that year's finalists. Olivia's heart pounded against her ribs, a muffled drum only she could hear. Megan held her hand, fingers cold but firm. The presenter opened the envelope with a theatrical flourish. A dense silence fell over the theater. "And the Chicago Literary Award goes to Olivia Reed for Chronicles of Silence." For an instant, the world froze. Olivia didn't move. The words echoed through the hall, but took time to find a place in her mind. It was Megan's tight hug and Alex's radiant smile that brought her back to reality. A surprised silence took over the audience for a second, quickly replaced by a wave of applause. It was genuine, warm applause that grew in volume until it became an ovation. People began to stand, first in the front rows, then spreading through the entire theater. A sea of smiling faces and hands clapping in unison, celebrating not just the work, but the story behind it, the story many there knew. Olivia stood, her legs a bit shaky, and walked toward the stage. Each step was a victory. She climbed the stairs, the spotlight enveloping her, and accepted the heavy, cold trophy. She approached the microphone, looked at the audience, at that sea of anonymous faces, and took a deep breath. Her voice, when it came out, wasn't shaky. It was firm, clear, the voice of someone who had finally found her place. "Thank you," she began, a soft smile appearing on her lips. "A few years ago, I was told I dreamed too big, that the stories I wanted to tell were a waste of time." Her gaze didn't search for anyone in particular, but her words had a specific address. "But I learned that dreams aren't measured by the height they reach in the sky, but by the depth of the roots they create within us. And it was from the rubble of my own life that I built the best of my worlds." The simplicity and strength of her words sank deep into the audience. The applause that followed was even more thunderous. Standing, the crowd acclaimed her, celebrating the woman who had turned pain into art, silence into literature. In the dimness of the audience, Daniel remained seated, motionless, an island of silence in an ocean of sound. He watched the woman on stage, the ex-wife he had discarded, now bathed in light, acclaimed, victorious. He was the only person in that theater not applauding. His hands were inert on his knees, heavy as lead. Beside him, Victoria tried to feign indifference, clapping mechanically, the smile frozen on her face, but the discomfort, the humiliation, were visible in her eyes. She looked at Olivia on stage and saw the reflection of her own failure. Daniel didn't feel pride. He didn't feel anger. He felt a deep emptiness, the realization of a monumental miscalculation. He, the engineer, the man who prided himself on his vision, on his ability to assess the value of things, had made the worst assessment of his life. He had traded gold for brass. He traded a solid structure, built with the truth of the soul, for a facade of luxury that crumbled at the first wind. Some build walls to protect themselves, to isolate, to display power. Others build bridges to connect, to understand, to reach the other. Olivia, abandoned midway, built neither. She learned to cross alone, and upon reaching the other side, discovered she no longer needed the bridge. A month after the night at the Chicago Civic Opera House, Olivia's life was no longer defined by the echo of an ovation, but by the calm of a found purpose. Winning the Chicago Literary Award didn't turn her into a celebrity, but gave her something much more precious: legitimacy. Doors that were once half open now swung wide. She was sitting in the meeting room of Alex's publishing house, a modern space with glass walls overlooking the bustling Michigan Avenue. On the polished wooden table, a contract waited for her signature. It wasn't for a second printing of Chronicles of Silence, but for her first novel, the story that had begun to be born in the black-covered notebook on the night she discovered the betrayal. Alex was by her side, the paternal smile of someone seeing a talent fully bloom. She picked up the pen, the familiar weight of the object in her hand, and signed her name with the same firm handwriting with which she had written the first sentence of that book. It wasn't just a contract, it was the materialization of a rebirth, proof that the world she had built in silence would now have a place on shelves and in the hearts of thousands of people. As she left the publisher, with the afternoon sun warming her face, she felt her phone vibrate in her bag. It was a number she hadn't seen in a long time, but recognized instantly. Daniel. The message was short, almost telegraphic, a pathetic attempt to reinsert himself into her narrative. "Proud of you." The phrase hovered on the screen, devoid of any genuine emotion. Proud. The same word he had never used when she needed it most, when a drop of encouragement would have been like water in the desert. Now, with her validation coming from the whole world, his words sounded hollow, opportunistic, an empty echo. Olivia looked at the message for a long moment, not with anger nor with pain, but with the indifference of someone looking at an artifact from a past life, a fossil of an extinct feeling. She didn't feel the need to respond, to thank, to confront. Silence, her oldest and most faithful tool, was once again the most eloquent response. She put the phone back in her bag and continued on her way, feeling a lightness that didn't come from the absence of weight, but from the strength to carry herself. Later, in her apartment, she opened a new notebook and wrote a single sentence, not with bitterness but with the clarity of a final epiphany. Who once doubted my dreams now lives inside one of them, as a secondary character. In a cafe somewhere in Wrigleyville, with uncomfortable designer chairs and an ambient soundtrack that tried, unsuccessfully, to fill the void, Daniel and Victoria sat facing each other. A heavy silence hung between them, broken only by the clink of silverware. There was no longer the complicity of lovers, nor the partnership of the ambitious. There was only the boredom of two strangers who knew each other too well. Victoria scrolled through her phone feed with an expression of chronic discontent. Daniel stared at the coffee cooling in his cup, his shoulders hunched under the weight of failures he still didn't know how to name. His gaze drifted to the newspaper left on the next table. The headline in the culture section jumped out at him, the bold black letters forming a sentence that seemed directed at him. Chicago teacher wins National Literature Award and signs with major publisher. Below the headline, a photo of Olivia, not from the award night but a recent casual one. She was smiling, a genuine smile, her eyes shining with a light he never knew how to ignite. He read her name, Olivia Reed, and the name sounded like that of a celebrity, a public figure, someone infinitely distant from the woman who once waited for him with a hot dinner. He felt a tightness in his chest, a mix of regret and corrosive envy, the envy of someone who sees another achieve a kind of happiness that money can't buy and that he didn't even know existed. He traded her for the promise of a bigger world, a world of concrete, status, and superficial admiration. He traded the woman who dreamed for one who made him feel big. Today, the woman who dreamed is the one the whole world admires. And he, sitting in the dimness of his own life, became the only man who can't applaud. Because to applaud, he would have to admit the most devastating truth of all, that the only thing without ambition in his life wasn't her dreams, but his own inability to see them. What did you think of this story? On a scale of 0 to 10, what score would you give? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to receive all our stories, and click here to watch another surprising story. Thanks and see you there.